Most of the time, when you see a movie, I would say that you can fairly easily assess whether you liked it and what about it made it work or not. Maybe you're watching a comedy. You might say, I like this movie, it was funny, the jokes landed. Or maybe you're watching a drama. You might say, I didn't like this movie. The characters were unrelatable and didn't interest me. But what about in cases more complex than that? Maybe you saw a film that had a lot of compelling elements that just don't quite mix together, and while you enjoyed parts of it, you just can't quite say that you liked it. Something just doesn't click with you about it, and you can't quite say what. The structure's solid, but the movie just feels a bit off. In this way, I believe that The Hobbit is a highly informative case study. There's no one thing wrong with the film that I can point to that's wrong. Smarter minds than mine have tried, pointing to the endless list of things they added, studio meddling, which turned the planned 2 films into 3, the pointless Rings cameos. But really, the most salient criticism that I can find would be this.
And that, I think, is the essence of these movies. Moments of brilliance wasted in a product that, on the whole, tries to have it all ways and in the process just pulls itself apart at the seams. These movies they make me feel drained. I don't hate them, I feel nothing.
In essence, the lights are on but nobody's home. All the elements that Screenwriting 101 taught us about are here. You've got your 3-act structure and your hero's journey, all the elements that are meant to define the pacing of a good story, but something is missing. And for the longest time, I just couldn't articulate what it was. Until...
Yes, so I think this movie is a great example of narrative storytelling cake. If the only point of this movie was to retcon trust fund Peter Parker into being scrappy little nobody, and it was just a multiverse plot within the confines of the MCU, it would have been stupid as hell. The MCU internal parts of this movie are so weak and contrived and so dumb. But once we start getting these other characters and the villains and eventually the other Spider-Mans, it becomes so much more fun because we're seeing what happens when you put 2 Spider-Mans in a room, what happens when you put 3 Spider-Mans in a room, what happens when you call out Peter and all 3 of them turn their heads. You get those kinds of fun moments of the stuff of, early 2010s Tumblr posts of Avengers coffee shop AUs. That was the height of MCU fandom, was just us thinking what these characters would do if they were in a room together hanging out. And that is so much fun. And the conversations they have are fascinating, insightful, deeply funny. The kinds of conversations that resolve lingering character arcs from the earlier movies where Tobey... That kind of stuff is narrative cake. It's empty calories in terms of storytelling, but it has value and fun to us as an audience that makes it worth whatever nonsense, we had to do to get to this point of...
And suddenly, it all made sense. There are a lot of elements that bring a story, even a single shot, together. Take any shot you can think of, and you'll find these interlocking elements of character development, tension, music, artistry, context. The list could go on and on. Organizing these elements into a singular whole is basically the primary act of filmmaking. What I believe The Hobbit is missing is a central drive toward that cake, that delectable center that makes a story worth visiting and revisiting. While you might have all the pieces necessary contained within your structure, they all need to function cohesively with a drive toward that central piece. This is why a story like Spider-Man: No Way Home can get away with its lackluster and paper-thin plot. The plot isn't the reason why people came to see the movie. The success of a Marvel movie isn't in the complexity of the plot or the thoughtfulness of its themes, but in the intrigue of its character's journey. It is, after all, their name on the movie poster. The part of the film people want is the zany interactions, the jokes, and the parts where the hero pushes themselves beyond their limits. In this way, the emotional resonance of the elements presented is more important to telling a cohesive story than pacing or even than relevance to the central plot. With this in mind, we can return to The Hobbit. When analyzing The Hobbit, the largest difference that it has as an adaptation is the long list of things that were added, and on some level, I can see and understand why certain changes were made. A good example would be the role of Azog, the Pale Orc. I'm no Tolkien lore aficionado, but to my knowledge, the role was made from whole cloth for the sake of the movie, and looking at it on its face, I can understand why they did this. Adding in a consistent antagonist adds a coherent through line which adds a much-needed tension to the overall journey, where in the book, most chapters feature their own smaller conflicts featuring one-off antagonists and conflicts. A movie would work better with an underlying antagonist to drive the story forward. Additionally, it means that in the final movie, instead of secondary protagonist Thorin's death being a bit spontaneous and random, his death comes at the hands of a well-developed antagonist with a pre-existing relationship with our heroes. So adding this character is fine in itself, but this quickly falls apart in its execution. While including a short setup would have been fine, there are at least 3 points the first film cuts away from the central action to have a generic scene involving him. And in terms of its economy of time, this is a terrible idea. The problem is that Azog is almost exclusively Thorin's antagonist, not Bilbo's. In fact, throughout the almost 9-hour runtime of the entire trilogy, Bilbo and Azog never exchange a single line of dialogue. Additionally, there's the added subplot of the random necromancer, originally just a catalyst to remove Gandalf from the story so that our central characters would need to operate without a previous overpowered crutch, is now Sauron, the antagonist of the next trilogy. This, again, makes a rather spontaneous plot point actually have some build-up, but has the secondary problem of taking up easily 40 minutes of the movie on a conflict that, again, is not at all related to Bilbo and his journey. The relevant tension isn't will Sauron rise? He does. There are 3 whole other movies about that. It definitely isn't will the dwarves make it through this peril. It's not the kind of story where you can just kill people off randomly. And it's not even will the dwarves make it to the mountain. While that's the ostensible conflict of the story, the more relevant emotional conflict revolves around Bilbo himself. Will he continue onward, or will he turn back? How can he fit in among these dwarves and wizards? When the movie is focusing on this, it's at its best, but the rest of the film seems very uninterested in exploring this question, instead wasting minutes at a time focusing on these pointless action sequences. All of which begs the question, why? The short answer to this question is that The Hobbit has a central identity struggle between the actual content of the book it is adapting and the fact that the studio clearly wanted a prequel trilogy to The Lord of the Rings that would match the epic tone and grand scale of the original. Why are we developing Thorin's antagonist? Because Discount Viggo Mortensen here is meant to be the tragic king on a quest to reclaim his kingdom with all the gravitas that implies. Why are we spending so long in this boring council scene? Because suddenly the stakes are way higher if all of this is a prelude to a world-shaking war that takes place 60 years in the future. Why do we have so many prolonged action sequences of our characters fighting through hordes of enemies? Because The Lord of the Rings had multiple battle sequences like this, and what better way is there to show how massive your story is than to smash 2 opposing armies against each other? The critical difference as to why these things worked in The Lord of the Rings and did not in The Hobbit is the all-important contextualizing factor of why are we here? In The Lord of the Rings, the battle scenes actually could kill characters, and the battle scenes actually develop the characters and the plot because the story is actually centrally about the war that these battles are a microcosm of. They connect to the thing that the audience is meant to care about. Not so with The Hobbit. While it can generally be difficult to predict what an audience might become attached to before either the story or the audience exists, there are some key markers that are useful to keep in mind. Genre and vision. In matters of genre, on a purely mechanical level, oftentimes an audience will entertain a story for its presence as part of a genre. So, to point to an obvious example, a romance story attracts its audience for the romance, and therefore emotional investment in that central romance and the conflict that separates them is a necessity. And time should never be spent on something that isn't meant to emotionally invest the audience in the developing relationship between the primary characters or developing the obstacles to the success of that relationship. In terms of vision, as a less constructionist note, any piece of art is necessarily an act of communication, and understanding what you intend to communicate in terms of emotional resonance or the literal moral of the story is crucial to investing an audience in that message, and this is where The Hobbit shows its failures. The Hobbit, the film, was not made to communicate a deeply held and sincere emotional belief or experience. It was made as the next big fantasy blockbuster brought to you by the creators of The Lord of the Rings. And while there are moments of genuine emotional resonance, these are more often than not holdovers from the book, which was written as art to communicate a deeply held, sincere belief and message. which further, I think, really demonstrates the transcendental power of a good emotionally resonant story, in that even when abstracted by several layers of corporate construction that failed to understand the story at every point, the love, care, and light of the story can still shine through.
You don't have one. A home. It was taken from you. But I will help you take it back if I can.
Now, if only the filmmakers had taken 10 seconds to look at whose face was on the goddamn movie posters.